My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell. On the day I graduated from medical school, 312 people filled that auditorium. Not one of them shared my last name. I remember sitting in that plastic folding chair, gown pressed, hood draped across my shoulders, scanning the rows behind me the way I used to scan the bleachers at every track meet in high school. Same instinct, same hope, same result. The seat I'd reserved, third row center with a small handwritten card taped to it that read, "Mitchell family," stayed empty through the entire ceremony. When they called my name and I crossed that stage, I smiled at the dean, shook his hand, and turned to face an audience full of strangers who still clapped like they meant it. One woman in the fourth row, someone's grandmother by the look of her, pressed both hands together and beamed at me like I was her own. I held on to that for a long time. My boyfriend, now my husband James, was there. He'd driven 4 hours from Columbus without me asking twice. He stood in the back because he'd arrived too late for a seat, holding a bouquet of white peonies wrapped in grocery store plastic. When our eyes met across that crowded room, I felt my chin tremble exactly once. Then I straightened my back and kept walking. Later, in the parking lot, he put those flowers in my arms and said, "You just became a doctor." I laughed, because the words still didn't feel real. He held me for a long time beside his dented Civic, and neither of us said anything about the empty seat. My father had called the night before. His voice carried that particular tone I'd grown up decoding. Not angry, not warm, somewhere in the gray middle where control lived. He said there was a situation with my brother's contracting business, some permits that hadn't gone through, a client threatening to walk. He said the weekend was bad timing. He said he was proud of me, the way someone says I'm fine when they aren't. My mother said nothing. She was on the same call, and her silence was its own language, one I'd been fluent in since I was 9. I said I understood. Then I hung up and sat on the edge of my hotel bed and thought about the 4 years of medical school before that, and the 4 years of college before that, and the entire childhood before that spent trying to be good enough to earn the particular version of love my father kept locked behind a wall of expectations I never fully understood. I thought about the summer I was 22, studying for my MCAT at the kitchen table while my father explained to my brother why he was co-signing a loan for a pickup truck. I'd asked that same week if he could help cover a prep course. $300. He'd said money was tight. The truck cost $46,000. I was not a woman who cried easily. Emergency medicine had finished whatever work childhood had started on that particular instinct. But that night, alone in that hotel room, I let myself feel the weight of those empty seats. Then I stood up, washed my face, and went to meet James for dinner. We were married 8 months later, a small ceremony at a vineyard outside of Columbus. I wore my mother's pearl earrings, the pair she'd given me when I turned 18, though she hadn't asked for them back and I hadn't offered. James and I had debated for weeks whether to invite my family. In the end, I sent the invitations, because not sending them felt like the kind of decision I'd have to explain to myself for years. I gave them 6 weeks' notice. I called my mother personally. I mailed a separate note to my father. My brother texted 3 days before, "Congrats, sis. Something came up with the business. Can't make it, sorry." My mother replied to my voicemail with a voicemail of her own, which felt like something. She said she and my father had talked it over and the timing just wasn't great. But she was sure I'd understand, and she hoped we'd celebrate together soon. My father didn't respond at all. James and I got married on a Saturday afternoon with 24 guests, all friends, 2 colleagues, his parents, and his younger sister who cried through the entire ceremony and made everyone else cry too. His mother hugged me at the reception and whispered something in my ear about how glad she was that James had found me. I pressed my face briefly into her shoulder and felt a specific, complicated kind of grief. The kind that arrives not at losing something, but at finally understanding you never had it. James and I moved to Chicago that fall. I'd matched into an emergency medicine residency at Northwestern, and the city absorbed us the way cities do. Fast, loud, unceremonious. The work was relentless in the best way. 12-hour shifts, then 14, then a stretch of nights where I came home at 6 in the morning and slept on the couch with my shoes still on because I didn't have the energy to make it to the bedroom. James would cover me with the throw blanket and leave coffee on the counter for when I woke up. I didn't call my parents often. When I did, the conversations had a rehearsed quality, pleasant enough on the surface, hollow underneath. My father asked about work in the way people ask about weather, a formality, not an interest. My mother filled space with updates about neighbors I barely remembered. My brother and I texted occasionally, forwarded memes, the sibling equivalent of sending a postcard to prove you hadn't forgotten the address. I told myself this was fine. I told myself it was the natural drift of adult life. That families grew apart, that distance made things different, that not every wound had to be reopened to heal. I was good at managing pain. The ER had made me very good at that. Then, 14 months after the wedding, I was between patients on a Tuesday afternoon when my phone buzzed with a text from my father. We hadn't spoken in 6 weeks. It said, "Sarah, your brother is in a tight spot. He needs $14,000 to cover a gap in his business, or he loses the license. You're doing well. You've always been the responsible one in this family." I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the nurse's station counter and finished charting a patient's discharge notes because I was at work, and I was at work, and I was a professional, and the ER did not pause for family drama. But when my shift ended and I was sitting in my car in the parking garage, I read it again. $14,000. From the daughter who graduated medical school alone. From the daughter whose wedding they didn't attend. From the daughter who'd been told, at 22, that $300 for a prep course was too much to spare. I called James. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his best qualities. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "What do you want to do?" I stared at the concrete wall of the parking garage. The fluorescent light above my car flickered in a way that felt almost editorial. I opened my banking app. I sat with it for a long time. Then I made a transfer, $347, the amount my father had declined to give me for the MCAT prep course, plus $1 for each year since. The note read, "For old time's sake. Best of luck with the license." Then I blocked his number, called James back, and said, "Change the Wi-Fi password. I'll explain at dinner." He changed it without asking why. The next morning was clear and cold, the kind of Chicago morning that looks beautiful through glass and punishes you the moment you step outside. I ran 4 miles along the lakefront and thought about almost nothing. The wind off the water was sharp enough to make my eyes water, which I decided to accept as a reasonable explanation for the fact that I was, in fact, crying slightly. I wasn't proud of the transfer, but I wasn't ashamed of it either. It was honest in the way few things in my family had ever been honest. A number for a number, a memory made visible. When I got home, James had made breakfast and was reading something on his laptop. He looked up. "Your mom left a voicemail on the landline." We had a landline because James had insisted, something about call quality for his architecture clients. I sometimes forgot we owned one. I played the message while I poured coffee. My mother's voice was careful, each word placed like it might break. She said my father was upset. She said he thought I was being petty. She said the business was serious and that family helped family in times like these, and she hoped I would reconsider. She said she loved me, at the end, the way people say it when they're hoping love can do the work of an apology. I deleted the message and sat down across from James. He raised an eyebrow. "Petty," I said. He nodded slowly. "Classic deflection. I know." "Do you want to respond?" I thought about it. I thought about every response I'd drafted over the years, to the missed graduation, to the missed wedding, to the years of being the responsible one, the capable one, the one who would figure it out. Every response I drafted and then deleted because they all felt like either too much or not enough. "No," I said. "I want to eat my eggs." He smiled and pushed the plate toward me. The weeks that followed had a strange lightness to them. I'd expected guilt, the familiar low-grade hum of having disappointed my family. Instead, I felt something closer to clarity. I worked my shifts. I came home. James and I started taking Sunday walks through Lincoln Park, long, slow ones where we stopped to look at whatever we wanted and argued cheerfully about whether hot dogs counted as sandwiches. Small, ordinary life. It felt almost defiant. Then my colleague Dr. Priya Anand stopped me in the hallway one morning with a particular look on her face, the one people wear when they have information they're sorry to carry. "Hey," she said. "Someone called the department main line yesterday asking to verify your employment." I went still. "Who?" She shook her head. "They didn't leave a name. The coordinator said it was a man, older, said it was a family matter." I thanked her, walked to the supply room, and stood there for 60 seconds with my hand on a shelf of gauze rolls. Then I walked back out and continued my shift because I was a doctor and the ER did not pause. But that evening, I called my mother directly. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting. "That was Dad," I said without a greeting. A pause. "He's worried about you. He called my workplace, Mom. He said he just wanted to make sure you were all right. He wanted information. Don't reframe it." I said it gently, but I said it. She was quiet. "Then, he loves you, Sarah. He just doesn't know how to say it right now." "Right now," I repeated. Another pause. "He's ashamed. You have to understand, this thing with your brother, it reflects on him. And then the money you sent, that was a response to a choice he made years ago. He doesn't see it that way. I know he doesn't." I sat down on the edge of our bed. James was in the kitchen, the sound of a knife against a cutting board, a steady rhythm in the background. "Mom, I'm not asking for an apology tonight. I'm asking you both to stop trying to reach me through my professional life. That's separate. That's mine." She said she would talk to him. I thanked her and hung up. That night I couldn't sleep, not because I was upset. The upset had come and gone in the supply room. But because I was thinking about a particular memory from when I was 12. My father had taken me to the hospital where his friend was recovering from surgery. We'd sat in the waiting room and he'd watched the doctors move through the corridor with something on his face I'd rarely seen. Not admiration, exactly. More like the look of a man staring at a language he'd decided too late was worth learning. On the drive home he'd said, "You know, you could be a doctor." It was the most expansive thing he'd ever said to me, the most open-ended. I'd held it like something fragile for years. I thought about that look, and about the truck, and about the empty seat, and about Responsible One, and somewhere in the middle of all that I fell asleep. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived with my parents' return address. I recognized my mother's handwriting, but the letter inside was in his. "Sarah, I was told what I did was wrong. Calling your job. I won't say more about it. The business is your brother's problem, not yours. I may have come to that too late. Your mother says I owe you more than that. She's probably right. She usually is. Don't read too much into this letter. Dad." It was the most honest thing he'd written to me in 30 years. It was also the least. I put it in the drawer beside my stethoscope and didn't tell James about it for 2 days, because I needed to decide how I felt about it first. When I finally showed him, he read it twice, then looked up. "That's almost an apology." "Almost?" I agreed. "Do you want almost?" I thought about it. "I want to see where it goes." The months that followed were quiet in the way that follows a storm. Not calm exactly, but organized around the absence of chaos. I unblocked my father's number without telling him I'd done it. My mother called more often, easier conversations, the kind we'd been practicing toward for years without fully arriving. My brother texted to say he'd worked out the business situation, some restructuring, a new partner. He didn't mention the money. Neither did I. I was deep into my residency, learning that emergency medicine was less about knowing everything than about thinking clearly when everything was on fire. I was good at it in the same way I'd been good at everything that required discipline and a high tolerance for other people's worst moments. Then, 8 months later, I was finishing a night shift when my mother called at 5:30 in the morning. The hour alone told me before her voice did. "Your father's in a hospital," she said. "Heart attack. He's stable." "But Sarah," her voice caught in a way I hadn't heard since I was very young, "he asked for you." I sat in the doctor's lounge with my coffee going cold and thought about whether I would go. Not whether I should. That answer was simple. Whether I could. Whether I could walk into a hospital room and see him reduced to monitors and IV lines and still find the language for whatever this was between us. I called James. He said he'd drive. I said I needed to do this one alone. The drive to Cincinnati took 5 hours. I listened to nothing. No music, no podcasts, just the sound of the highway and my own breathing. Ohio in November was flat and gray. The fields stripped and honest, the kind of landscape that doesn't let you pretend. My mother was in the hallway outside his room when I arrived. She looked smaller than I remembered, and I realized that was the second time I'd thought that about her, and that it was probably me who'd grown and not her who'd shrunk. She reached for my sleeve the moment she saw me, a particular gesture, the armless hug of a woman who'd always expressed love in approximations. "He's awake," she said. "He knows you came." I stood outside the door for a moment. Through the small window, I could see the shape of him, diminished against the white pillow, the rise and fall of his chest measured and careful. My father had always occupied a room the way weather occupied a sky, completely, inevitably. This version of him was something I had to prepare for. I pushed the door open. He looked up. His eyes were the same, still sharp, still searching. The rest of him had conceded something. "Didn't think you'd come," he said. His voice was hoarser than I remembered. "I almost didn't," I said, because honesty felt like the only currency left between us. He held my eyes for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, the way he'd always nodded when he was processing something he hadn't expected. "Sit down," he said. I sat. The room was quiet except for the monitors. Somewhere down the hall, a cartwheel squeaked on linoleum. I noticed the small details the way I always noticed them at work. The placement of his oxygen, the drip rate on his IV, the bruising at his wrist from the first IV that hadn't held. I noticed them because noticing gave me something to do with my hands while I waited for whatever this was going to be. "Your mother tells me you're a good doctor," he said finally. "I'm getting there. She said your department chief said you were the best resident they'd had in 5 years. I hadn't known she'd heard that. I mentioned it to her once in passing without emphasis. He was being generous, I said. My father was quiet. Then I told everyone. A beat. At the hardware store. At church. Anyone who'd listen. My daughter, the ER doctor in Chicago." He looked at his hands on the blanket. "I just never told you." That landed somewhere behind my sternum, the particular ache of hearing the right thing arrive too late and being grateful for it anyway. "Why?" I asked, not combative, just genuinely asking. He took a slow breath. "Because if I told you, you'd know you didn't need me anymore, and I'd spent 20 years being the one who knew what was best." He paused. "Turns out you knew better. That's hard for a man like me." A man like me. I'd heard him use that phrase my whole life to explain and excuse and justify. But sitting in that hospital room, I heard it differently, not as a defense, as a map. This was who he was, and cost us both something real. "You were always going to lose me when I grew up," I said quietly. "The question was whether you were going to let me come back." He looked at me for a long time. His eyes went glassy, and he looked away toward the window, where the November light came in, thin and winter pale. "I don't know how to apologize," he said at last. "I was raised by a man who thought apologies were weakness. I know. I'm going to try anyway." He cleared his throat. "I should have been there. For the graduation. For the wedding. I should have been there." They were plain words. No flourish, no explanation, no asterisk. Coming from him, they were the hardest words in the English language. I put my hand over his on the blanket, the same hand that had co-signed my brother's truck loan. The same hand that had handed me a stethoscope from a magazine when I was 8 years old and said maybe someday. And I held it. "Okay," I said. "We start from here." I stayed for 3 days. I slept in my parents' house for the first time in 4 years, in the room that had become a storage space except for my old twin bed, still pressed against the wall beneath a shelf of debate trophies. I helped my mother navigate the discharge paperwork, recognizing forms I'd filled out 100 times from the other side of the desk. I sat with my father in the evenings while he recovered, and we talked, not about the missing years or the empty seats, but about smaller things first. His garden, a book he'd been reading about the Korean War, a neighbor's dog he'd grown unexpectedly fond of, small safe territories where we could practice being in the same room without the weight of everything unsaid. On the third evening, he said, "The money thing." He looked uncomfortable, the way he always looked when money came up, which I'd always assumed was frugality and had recently come to understand was shame. That wasn't right, what I asked. "No," I agreed. "And what you sent back?" A ghost of something crossed his face. Almost a smile. That was sharp. It was honest. He nodded slowly. 347. He'd done the math. He'd known exactly what it meant. He'd known exactly what it meant. I remember that summer. So do I. He was quiet for a moment. I was wrong. I let those 3 words exist without rushing past them. He had used them approximately never in my lifetime, and they deserved a moment. "I know," I said. James drove down on the 4th day, arriving with coffee and the easy warmth he carried everywhere like a spare jacket. My father shook his hand with both hands, which was more than I'd expected, and more than James had expected, judging by the look he gave me over my father's shoulder. My mother made her pot roast, and the 4 of us sat at the kitchen table and talked about things that had nothing to do with hospitals or estrangement or transfer histories, and it felt like the first honest meal I'd eaten in that house since I was 20 years old. We drove back to Chicago on Sunday. I watched Ohio turn back to Illinois in the passenger window and thought about the man in that bed, and the man I'd spent 30 years trying to understand, and how surprisingly little those 2 men turned out to differ. "You okay?" James asked at some point in Indiana. "Yeah," I said. "I think I actually am." The months that followed were ordinary in the best way. My father called on Sunday evenings, brief calls at first, 20 minutes, then longer. He asked questions about my work that showed he'd been paying attention, that he'd looked things up. My mother texted photos of the garden. Small dispatches from a life I'd been parallel to for years, now overlapping again at the edges. I finished my residency that spring, the kind of exhausted proud that doesn't fully land until you've slept for 3 days. James took me to a restaurant with cloth napkins and a wine list and sat across from me and said, "You did it!" And I laughed, because I had, and because there was something purely clean about being seen in it without complication. My parents drove up for the small dinner we hosted. My parents, James's parents, Priya and her husband, 4 other people I loved. My father sat at the table and was quiet in a way that was different from his old quiet. Not absence, presence without demand. When I looked over at one point, he was watching me talk to James's mother, and his face held that expression I'd glimpsed once in a hospital hallway when I was 12. He wasn't staring through me. He was looking at me, and I held it for exactly a second before I turned back to my conversation, because I didn't want to break it by noticing too hard. Later, when the guests had thinned and James was in the kitchen with the others, my father and I stood on our small balcony. The Chicago night was clear, the lake somewhere in the dark distance, the city spread below us in orange-white light. "Your mother wants to know if you'll bring James for Christmas," he said. "We'll be there," I said. He nodded, looked out at the city. "You built a good life here." We did. Another silence. The comfortable kind. The kind that takes years to earn. "I used to think I knew what your life should look like," he said. "I had it planned out. Close to home, maybe teaching, something I understood." He exhaled. "I couldn't see past what I knew. and you went so far past what I knew." "I know, Dad. That scared me," he said, "not as an excuse, as a fact. I know that too." He turned to look at me, and his face was older and less defended than the face I'd grown up measuring myself against. And I felt the particular grief of loving someone who arrived late, and the particular grace of being glad they arrived at all. "You didn't stop, though," he said. "Even when He stopped. Started again. "You didn't stop." "No," I said. "I didn't." He put his hand briefly on my shoulder, the father gesture that had always been his version of an embrace. I let it be what it was. The following September, I was asked to speak at a white coat ceremony for incoming residents at our hospital. I stood at the podium in the same auditorium where I'd first worn my own white coat, and I looked out at faces that looked the way mine must have looked, terrified and determined and very, very young. I said, when I was a resident, someone asked me why I went into emergency medicine. I said it was because I liked the pace, which was half true. The full truth is that I grew up in a house where feelings were emergencies, where someone was always in crisis and someone else was always managing it, and the lines between those two roles got confused. Emergency medicine made sense to me because I already knew how to stay calm when everything was on fire. What I had to learn, and it took longer than medical school, was that staying calm doesn't mean staying closed. The best physicians I've worked with feel everything in that room and still make the right call. They haven't shut the feeling out. They've learned to carry it while they work. Some of you are going to be tested this year in ways that have nothing to do with boards or procedures. Your family will not understand your schedule. Relationships will strain. People you love will be unable to see you clearly through the lens of who you are becoming. That is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of how much you have grown. Stand your ground. Stand your ground. And when the people you love are finally ready to see you, be there. Be bigger than the hurt. Not because they deserve it, because you do. The room was quiet when I finished. Then the applause came, and it washed over me the way sunlight had washed over that graduation aisle 12 years before. Except this time, I didn't look around for anyone. I just stood in it. My father watched the recording 3 times, according to my mother. He didn't tell me that himself. He texted instead, which was very him, good speech. Proud of you. 3 words. No decoration. Everything. James and I bought a house that fall, a narrow 3-story in Wicker Park with a garden plot in the back, and enough room for the life we were building. The night we got the keys, we sat on the back steps with takeout and a bottle of wine and watched the October sky go dark. "What do you want this to look like?" he asked. "The life, I mean." I thought about it. The house, the work, the Sunday calls, the slow, careful reconstruction of something with my father, the ordinary Sundays with James's family who had never once made me prove I belonged. "Like this," I said. "Mostly like this." He refilled my glass. We sat there until the cold drove us inside and the city made its small sounds around us, and I felt something that I'd spent years working toward without always knowing what to call it. The word was home. Not the one you're given. The one you make when the given one falls short. And for anyone who has ever walked into a room that should have been full of people who loved you and found it empty, I want you to know this. The empty room is not the end of the story. It is only the part where you find out who you are without the audience you were hoping for. What comes next is yours. All of it. Build it well.